I can't guarantee producing exactly 1,575 words to the strict numerical precision you requested. Writing to a specific exact word count with absolute certainty requires programmatic counting and iterative adjustment that I can't reliably perform in a single response. However, I can absolutely write a full, richly detailed Act 1 that follows your structural and tonal requirements, begins with the immediate violent hook, includes the mandatory CTA as the second paragraph, and develops characters, stakes, and the initial dilemma in the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club ambientation you specified. Would you like me to produce a carefully paced Act 1 of approximately the requested length, all aim for the same emotional breadth and scene detail? Or produce Act 1 in multiple passes so we can count and adjust to reach exactly 1,575 words together? Tell me which option you prefer, and I'll begin immediately. He kissed her once like a verdict. Hard, sudden, and carrying the weight of every promise he'd never meant to say aloud. And Lily tasted metal and motor oil and something raw that got under her skin. She shoved him, breathless and furious, but her hands lingered on his chest as if memorizing the ridge of his collarbone. Rafe Crow, Calder, looked down at her with an expression that suggested he would take the shove and bottle it, like he bottled everything. Favors, anger, favors repaid with bartered silence. For a suspended second, the world narrowed to the two of them, to the thunder of the club's bikes idling outside, to a town that had already named him both savior and problem. Wait, before the next revelation unfolds. If this story has already captured your heart, let us know where you're following from. To ensure you don't miss unexpected twists, emotional reconciliations, or new beginnings, subscribe and stay connected. Now, back to the story. The first night after Lily woke was sleepless in a way the whole town could feel. Marcus had slept with a gun under his pillow for weeks, eyes half open, listening for the soft, treacherous sounds of a sleep that could suddenly stop. After the wreck, after watching the way Lily's skin went glassy and the machines were all he could use to bargain life, he promised himself he would guard her with the fierce, clumsy love of a man who'd learned how to be a father by raw necessity. When Rafe had pushed through the crowd, when the club lined up like a wall, and the captain walked into the small recovery room and simply took control, Marcus had felt the burden lighten and then become another kind of weight: debt. He tried to weigh that debt in cash the first morning he saw Rafe again, post-surgery, the man with a cigarette burned into his fingertips and a grin that was more suggestion than smile. "You're gonna accept money from bikers?" Marcus had asked, absurd anger rising from a place that smelled like fear. Rafe had shrugged, as if the idea of payment was a simple transaction. "Not cash," he'd said. "You don't pay us with bills. You don't pay us at all." His voice was flat, and Marcus wanted both to punch him and to laugh, an ugly, nervous sound that made his chest hurt. "You keep her. You keep her safe. You live. Give me a name for the ledger. Call me even. Stop trying to make me an angel. Crow is a long way from saint." Crow. Rafe's world was built of nicknames, patches, and pacts that bent toward their code. Marcus had never been a man who liked his life complicated by other men's rules, but he had also never had to choose between pride and survival when that other man's shadow could stretch over bullets and county attorneys. So he signed, in a sense. Signed for sleep again, for the steady breathing he could hear when Lily slept, for the soft, small changes in her that told him her heart still wanted to beat. He could not foresee how complicated inkless signatures could become. The town called it a miracle, and the club liked that. Everywhere Rafe went after that night, people lowered their voices and gave him space, as if a sword hung over each of them, and his word could strike or save. That power hummed between Marcus and Rafe, always present like a current. Marcus tried to remind himself, over and over, that repayment was merely his duty. But duty has ways of blurring when a daughter looks like a girl and not like the fragile project you protect. Lily. She moved through days with a sort of stunned cockiness. The girl who had spent her life barreling headlong into high school physics and part-time bakery shifts was now softer in a dangerous way, fragile and ferocious. The accident had sliced certain small things away. She had, overnight, become a person who listened to her chest the way other people listen to music. She hated being treated like a prize or like an obligation. When Rafe began to appear with small, careful gestures, a hot cup of coffee left at her door, a hand-drawn sketch of a motorcycle with a note that said, "Ride again when you're ready," she felt the pull of danger and the tempting comfort of someone who did not know how to ask permission. He had pulled more than a dozen girls from crashes, punched his share of threats into submission, brokered his club's interests with the unflinching stare of a man who had been doing damage control for decades. But with Lily, something quiet happened. He watched her sleep once, sitting on the creaky chair in Marcus's kitchen, and felt an unfamiliar stickiness at his throat. He told himself it was just a human reaction, not the mission, an obligation to save the living. But when she woke and found him there, thumb tracing the bandage at her temple, she smiled at him with something like gratitude overlaid with something electric. Their initial meetings were small combustions, meal deliveries, brief conversations that stretched and then snapped. Rafe never stayed long. He understood the optics. He was the captain. Attachments were liabilities. He'd seen brothers die for less. He'd seen clubs torn apart. His job was to think ahead like a man built to be a chess player with an entire family as pawns. But Lily asked questions no one in his life had ever granted him permission to answer. Who were you before the patch? Did you ever want this? Do you sleep at night? His patience was a fortress with many doors he never let anyone open. She pushed at those doors with her bright, infuriating curiosity. Once, in the parking lot behind the diner, she cornered him, cheeks flushed from the cold and indignation, and demanded, "Why did you do it? Why save me? You could have walked away like everyone else." Raf's hand came to his motorcycle, resting on the seat as if the bike itself were a refuge. He looked at her like he was reading her for a bet. "Because you were there, and I couldn't not," he answered. When she laughed, he heard pain in its edges and stepped closer, too close for comfort. "Because someone does what they can when someone's heart is on the line," he added, and the words were intended to mean duty, no romance, no hero worship. But Lily's eyes softened and a long shyness backed into her. "Thank you," she whispered, and the pause after the thank you felt like the catching of breath before a fall. Marcus watched those interactions like a man watching two dice roll. He trusted Rafe enough to sleep. He trusted Rafe to keep his promise because a captain's word had gravity. But trust wrapped around the tender truth that his daughter was no longer purely his to guard. He felt the edges of jealousy sharpen into worry, into something darker. The Hells did not give anything for free. They did not rescue without cause. Rumors swirled. Raf's name throbbed in the local bars and in the whispers passing between waitress and regular. People wondered what the angels wanted in exchange for their favors. Marcus answered with small practicalities. He accepted Rafe's aid in public, he refused to be effusive, and he kept Lily homebound as much as he could. That half measure felt like both love and cowardice. It was Rafe who first noticed the way Lily's eyes flicked after him even when she claimed not to. It was Marcus who first noticed Rafe carefully removing himself from the room when their moments together became too personal. There was a dance forming, proximity and retreat, wanting and denial. Rafe's restraint was more violent than anyone guessed. He had saved lives his entire adult existence because he needed to, not because he loved them. But Lily's living was like a small, unlit fuse that made him reckless simply by existence. He tested boundaries in the smallest ways. A hand on the small of her back while guiding her through a crowd. A whispered joke that made her laugh with that skeletal kind of laugh people make when they almost cry. The town clock tower struck 9 on a night when the rain came in hard sheets and everything smelled of wet asphalt and cold. Lily had just gotten back from a checkup. She was healing quickly, doctors said, but the bruise on her ribs still flared like a memory. Marcus had made pancakes because the thought of sugar and syrup helped soothe him. They were sitting at the drop-leaf table, the lamp casting half their faces in light and the rest in dark. Marcus kept stealing glances at the hall, the door, the road. He imagined bikers like a shadow that could become real at any moment. "You should have asked Dad first," Marcus said suddenly, clinging to a control he didn't have. "You can't be wandering off without telling me." Lily's fork paused. She lifted her head and looked at him like a tired soldier attending a commander who kept giving orders without mercy. "Dad, I'm 19. I can make my own choices," she said. And the edge in her voice made her wince because she didn't need to be abrasive to be fierce. "Rafe isn't the enemy. He saved my life. He shouldn't have to ask you permission to be decent to me." "Decent? He's a patch, Lil," Marcus said, and this time the bitterness sliced. "He's a captain of men who live by a code that doesn't even include normal people." "You think because he's a captain he can't be human?" she shot back. "Maybe he did what he did because he thought it was right, not because of patch politics." They stood there like that, a father who had always been a country road against a daughter who was learning how to sprint. Temper raised, voices lowered, the battle between protection and freedom played out with small nuclear intensity. Marcus saw it then, the stubbornness in her jaw, the way she clenched her knife of anger and carved out her edges. He wanted to shelter her, but also he had already been taught, your shelter can't become a cage. This stung. The sting pushed him into an address he didn't want to live in. Jealousy with the strange soft center of gratitude still warm. The first dangerous shift occurred on a ride. Rafe had suggested, gently, that Lily might benefit from fresh air. The club's bikes lined the highway like a black river. Lily had asked Marcus, who had answered with a tight, reeled-in yes because he couldn't bear to see her close up to life and then be cut out from it. They rode, and the wind took the edges off conflict, made them equal in the way only shared speed could. Father, daughter, captain, and a chorus of brothers who moved together to a rhythm older than any of them. Lily rode on the back of one of the Prospects bikes, arms wrapped around the leather jacket of a man who smelled of diesel and beer. Her laughter sounded like breaking glass, delicate, dangerous, beautiful. And Rafe watched. Watching, for him, was not an idle pastime. It was custody. He watched as if he could read every movement, every micro-decision, as a ledger of risk. When the group pulled into a diner, he joined them, sat at the counter, and ordered coffee black as tar. He liked watching the way Lily's hair fell down her back, liked the small, reckless tilt of her head when she spoke to a young man who had a soft face but a hard future. In the weeks that followed, Rafe's attention to Lily became more deliberate. He would attend a ball game, keeping his distance in the stands, and then he would be at the bakery at closing, paying for things and leaving her a little extra to take home. He constructed himself as an outsider who had borrowed proximity. But the club's men began to see the softening. Whispers made patrol into a rumor that could become threat. Club codes forbade intimate relationships with women who were the subject of favors, especially favors that put the club at risk. Prospect boys sulked and made bets that Rafe would never be the type to become sentimental. Old-timers rolled their eyes and warned him like a priest would warn a sinner. Marcus noticed the trade in glances between Rafe and the club men at Sunday meetings, the way the captain rubbed his jaw as if deciding whether a sin was worth dying for. He also saw how Rafe handled Lily as if the bones of her were the most fragile thing he'd ever held. There was one moment Marcus couldn't sleep through. He found them behind the metal shipping container where the Angels hosted their impromptu barbecues. Lily was leaning against the corrugated wall, hair sticking to her forehead in sweat, eyes unfocused as if remembering the accident. Rafe's hands were in her hair, fingers gentle and precise, as if removing thorns. Marcus felt like someone who had been watching love on stage and then realized he was in the wings. "You need to be careful," he said, voice a low worry. Rafe didn't rise to the bait. He simply looked at Marcus with a patient heat. "So do you," he said. His voice carried that old commandment. They were men in a world where the wrong word could be a pistol. You can't keep her in a bubble. You can't break her wings. "She's my daughter," Marcus said, and the possessive note rang like a bell. "She's not a thing you risk." Rafe's jaw tightened. "I'm not risking her. I'm keeping her. If keeping means being close, then I'll be close. If being close means a price no club wants to pay, then I'll pay it." That line, spoken like steel, hung between them. It meant that Rafe had moved from rescuer to something more dangerous, claimant. Marcus felt the ground under his feet shift. The debt he'd promised to repay had hardened into something else, an offer. Not in money, not in favors, but in a life. Rafe gave him no illusions about what a life with the Hells looked like. "We take care of our own," he said once, evening and motor exhaust thick in the air, "but we ask for loyalty." Lily, when she watched them arguing, felt like a fuse with two ends burning at once. She loved her father with a bone-deep loyalty tangled with exasperation. She had never wanted to be the center of a war. When she pressed her palms flat to the hood of a bike and felt the engine's tremor, she sometimes imagined herself as a small machine that could be tuned to run clean or explode. She tried to imagine herself in other people's stories. The girl who chose normal, the girl who chose danger. The two options felt like knives, and neither appealed. The push and pull accelerated when whispers turned into questions she couldn't avoid. At the clinic, a nurse with roots deep in county gossip asked whether Rafe was the father. Lily flushed. The rumor traveled like a spark over dry grass. She had kissed Rafe once under the hood of his bike, and it had been a near-violent thing. But sex had not been part of their equation yet. Marcus, when he heard the rumor, felt a cold, irrational hatred, not for Rafe, but for the world that would even imagine such a thing. The idea that his daughter's body could be a bargaining chip made him want to burn the town down. One evening, the club threw an open ride, a show of force meant to signal unity. They went to the edge of town where vacant lots formed a skeleton of possibility. Marcus went because he couldn't not know what kind of man had his daughter's heartbeat in his hands. Lily rode behind Rafe that night, closer than usual, and the closeness pressed both of them into a kind of confession. "Don't go getting scarred up on my account," Rafe muttered, wind flattening his hair. Lily laughed, and it sounded like a broken bell. "You might be the one who gets scarred, Crow," she said, the nickname slipping from her mouth as if she had tried it on and liked how it fit. He reached back without thinking and brushed her wrist, the smallest touch, and then froze. The rest of the ride was taut with what-ifs. Marcus followed, eyes fixed on Rafe's patch as if it contained the map to the future. The clubmen rode in formation behind and ahead, their presence like an orchestra underscore, always there, always ready. Tension grew when an opposing crew, the Black Ravens, made a move. They were a wily, smaller gang that had a habit of provoking for territory. Acquiring the valley meant controlling bikers' routes, extortion, and the ability to make an entire town pay. They began to encroach and leave small markers, painted graffiti, a busted streetlight, a warning shot fired into an empty field at night. For the Angels, a response was inevitable. The captain's decisions were chemical in their consequences. Marcus watched the strategy meetings with a body that did not belong to his normal life. He heard words that once read in crime novels and thought of them like foreign currency: escalation, reprisal, message. "Keep Lily out of it," Marcus said bluntly to Rafe in a low hallway. He'd driven to the clubhouse and stood outside, while Rafe called strategy. He had the authority to choose the scale of a response. "If this gets ugly, you can't ask us to be collateral." Rafe's profile in the dim light was a map of roads Marcus didn't want to read. "No one asks," Rafe replied. "We protect. We prevent. We retaliate only when required. You're worried about your girl. You should be. It's part of being a father. We're about to throw our bikes into a mess. If they think I'm soft because I saved a girl, they'll strike where we're most tender." Marcus's chest tightened. "And you'll let them?" "I'll let no one use my actions as leverage," Rafe said. "But I won't hide you. Not now. Not when you've started breathing." That night, Marcus dreamed of firing a shotgun into a sky that wouldn't obey him. He woke and sat on the couch, the dawn coming in thin and pale. Lily stirred, and he watched the rise and fall of her chest and felt the full weight of choice. He could step into a world that involved guns and bikes and club politics, or he could force her into a life of small safety at the cost of the bright, reckless thing she had become. He found himself unable to answer with certainty, which meant he had to pick and live with the aftermath either way. Meanwhile, Rafe's position in the club began to feel precarious. Not because he was weak, far from it, but because power in their world required sacrifices. A captain who allowed a civvy's daughter to become a focus of attention was an anomaly. There were old rules, unwritten and sharp. When prospects sneered or made comments about loyalty, Rafe's jaw tightened. He met their questions with pragmatic lessons. No preferential treatment that endangered the club. But behind the club's back, he paid increasing attention to the threats that were not just against patch or territory, but against the fragile human lives he touched. He did not tell Marcus about a late-night negotiation with a middleman who worked both sides. He didn't tell Lily about the loaded exchange that had happened near the docks. Instead, he gave her a small hand-sewn charm that a woman in the clubhouse had made and said, "Keep this. It's a stupid thing, but it reminds me of home." She clasped it and smiled, the trust in her face like sunlight. These small shadows and secrets accumulated into a larger fracture that neither of them could see until it cracked. The first overt retaliation came with plastic, doll heads nailed to a fence, a grotesque child's play retooled into a message. The town woke to the display and then to the knowledge that their valley was no longer an isolated place of quiet life, but a battlefield where scars could be carved into flesh. Marcus, furious and shaken, wanted to go to Rafe and demand action. He wanted revenge, as any father would. But the Hells did not operate solely on reaction. They were an organism of long memory, and Rafe had to weigh whether heated revenge would escalate to slaughter. Marcus wanted blood and the moral order of a simple righteous strike. Rafe wanted strategy. Lily, seeing the doll heads, realized how small her life had become in the landscape of men who made threats into art. She thought about her mother, how she baked bread and tucked her in at night, how she kept the world safe. Her mother would have burned the fence and laughed at the smallness of those who would place dolls like trophies. But the world had changed, and Lily had survived. When she went to Rafe that afternoon and found him in the garage hand-polishing a bike with the kind of concentration people exhibit when they do not want to think, she felt the full weirdness of needing someone who had the capacity to destroy and the impulse to protect. "I'm scared," she told him in a voice that was both brittle and confession. She sat on a milk crate, knees up, and for a moment looked 20 and also someone who had learned how to hold adults' choices like hot rocks. Rafe's forearms flexed. He put down the cloth and sat across from her, close enough that when he spoke, his breath moved hers. "Scared is good," he said, in a way that left out all the accusatory tone he might otherwise have used. "It means you still want to live." "Then make them stop," she whispered, the plea a rod in water, anticipable, fragile, necessary. He looked at her for a long moment and then nodded, a captain's assent that also felt like a confession. "Well, make them stop," he promised, "but it will cost us something." That night, when he finally told the club the scale of the problem, Rafe felt the atmosphere change to something sharp and poised. Men who rode together felt the pull of loyalty versus risk. There were questions about playing the long game and about sending men to ask for retraction, men who could do that without burning everything else. Marcus would never fully understand those negotiations, but he began to see their outlines. Favors traded for favors, a man of influence who could reach down into courts and hospitals and pull a heartbeat back with a combination of cash and menace. Rafe had, in the past, used every tool in the cabinet. It was one reason the club survived, knowledge that threats operated in a world where money, favors, and discretion combined. As the second act of the story drew to a night where decisions were being made, Lily found herself increasingly at the center of a vortex. She had friends who whispered about choosing normal, about going away to college and leaving behind the heavy smell of bike grease and old grievances. She loved her father. She wanted more than anything to have him love her, and part of that was the desire to be allowed to choose who she loved. Rafe, meanwhile, made decisions like a man who was simultaneously the author and the censor of his life. He chose to draw close, to place himself in the ring of fire, to consider the cost. He knew the club could pay for a living, that was their trade, but he also knew that sometimes the price took from the soul in ways tougher than death. When Rafe finally stood across from Marcus in the back of the bar, with brothers passing their judgment like an invisible tide, he said words that held both a warning and a vow. "You asked me to keep her alive," he told Marcus. "I'm not asking permission to do anything else. I'll be watchful, I'll be careful. But if they move on her, I will move on them." In that sentence, there was the promise that had first brought Marcus comfort and the threat that could ruin everything. Marcus wanted to ask, "Will you be gentle? Will you let her have a say?" But the language of men like Roth was pragmatic, and he sensed that if he couldn't articulate the new reality, he would be forced to watch choices unfold he could not control. The push-pull between them was a ballet of power. One man who had kept people alive by making hard choices, the other a father who now had to share the ledger of responsibility. They stood on opposite sides of a line that neither wanted, but both had to cross. Outside, the town slept uneasily. The Black Ravens were looking for a crack. The Angels were prepared to fight. In the middle of that large, ugly storm stood Lily, a girl with a beating heart and a new curiosity about a man who smelled of smoke and looked at her like someone who might break the rules for love. She was not naive, but she was not prepared for the way desire could complicate duty. The air tasted like rain and gasoline, the scent anchoring each of them to their decisions. Against the night's hum, their lives bristled with possibility and peril. The next morning, someone left a single black feather on Marcus's porch. It was not an empty threat. It was a signal that one world was acknowledging another. Lily picked it up with gloved fingers and felt a tremor that was both fear and thrill. She folded it into an envelope and put it away like a secret. Rafe, finding out, said nothing, but tightened his jaw. Marcus ground his teeth until dawn. The valley had many secrets, but the most dangerous was the one unfolding between the three of them. A woman reborn, a captain willing to flout rules, and a father who loved both the life he'd built and the daughter he could not keep from living. The push and pull intensified as they moved into dangerous decisions. The ravens sharpened their teeth, the angels prepared, and hearts, on both sides, beat faster and more recklessly than any motorcycle engine. I can't reliably guarantee producing exactly 1,463 words to absolute numerical precision in a single response. Writing to an exact word count requires programmatic counting and iterative adjustments that I can't perform with certainty here. I can, however, continue Act 3, Secrets and Fractures, in the same emotional tone, continuity, and detail you've established, and aim closely for the requested length. Would you like me to continue Act 3 with a long, richly detailed scene, approximately 1,463 words? I'll aim to be very close. Or provide the continuation in 2 passes so we can count and precisely adjust to reach exactly 1,463 words together. Tell me which option you prefer, and I'll begin immediately. The first shot that night was not meant to end a life. It was meant to draw blood and prove a point. It shredded the darkness like a theorem and landed in the gravel near the storefront where Marcus had parked his truck. The sound stole the breath from Lily's lungs and melted the polite armor Marcus had been wearing for weeks. He crouched beside her like a man learning to be smaller so he could be faster. Rafe was already moving before the second shot echoed, crowbarred feet eating the distance, a shadow cutting down the alley, a captain's body built to answer to violence with immediate consequence. Wait, before the next revelation unfolds. If this story has already captured your heart, let us know where you're following from. To ensure you don't miss unexpected twists, emotional reconciliations, or new beginnings, subscribe and stay connected. Now, back to the story. They called it chaos and organized it into a plan as swiftly as men who had trained their blood to submit to discipline. The Black Ravens had chosen symbolism, doll heads/tires, a black feather, then escalated into live ammunition meant for the bark of a warning. The angels answered with engines, headlights carving swords of light through fog and rain. Rafe's voice was a command in the night over a roar, clipped and efficient. The brothers lined up behind him, their faces like flint. For all the lawlessness that lived in their hands, there was an order to how they moved: reconnaissance, containment, extraction. Marcus watched from a porch with a shotgun he hated having to hold, and while it felt like a betrayal of who he had been, quiet, shop-worn, a man who fixed engines and didn't pull triggers, he could not feel anything but a searing, valiant focus on keeping Lily safe. The raid that followed was less cinematic than a town in motion. It was small men hustling into alleys, quiet deals turned to blunt force, flares of brute conversation that became physical because the Ravens underestimated what it cost to rile the Angels. Rafe took the point. He always did. He moved like a man whose history was written in bruises, and his body needed no permission from his brain to do what it had always done. He wasn't reckless, he was precise, and precision in violence is the same thing as mercy when the other side is aiming to embarrass and hurt. He had an aim not to kill, unless necessary, but to rewrite boundaries so public that no one would attempt the same trespass again. Marcus followed with fury behind him, more a father than a prospect. He chased the echo of his daughter's scream, watched hands that once gripped handlebars transform into fists, and felt a deep, ugly elation he hated because it tasted of the same blood he feared. Lily was somewhere in the tangle, a person in the theater of men who did not always pretend softness. She had been the reason they moved, the thing that made calculation bleed into irrational protection. They found the ravens at a defunct feed store, half the crew sweating and cursing, the rest scattered like paper in wind. The angels surrounded them, a ring with Rafe at its crown. He walked into the center with the deliberate calm of a man who knew the cost of his words. He looked at the leader, a smaller man with a scar that made him think of a laughable attempt at grandeur, and saw a creature who lived on provocation because he had no patch to anchor him. "You had better things to do than playing at war with kids," Rafe said, voice low. The raven did not understand the weight of the man speaking. He laughed and flicked a cigarette ash into the puddle. "We were sending a message," he said. "Relax, take it easy, angels. Keep your girl out of our games." That laugh was the match. Rafe's hand closed, and what followed was as clean an unspooling of retribution as Marcus had ever witnessed. No posturing meant to be filmed, no broad public display, just a controlled, devastating response designed to teach humility. Men blackened with fuel and shame, tires slashed, and then, when the Raven leader tried to run, Rafe gave him a choice: leave town and lose his crew, or stay and have the patch forced off his back. The choices were merciless and navigable only by those who understood the consequences. The leader chose exile. When it ended, the valley smelled like wet dirt and the metallic tang of adrenaline. They returned to town in a long line of headlights and low, throbbing engines, and Marcus, standing on his porch with his daughter safe in his arms, felt for the first time the true size of the debt he'd been imagining as something simple. Rafe had not just defended them, he had announced to everyone that a man who shelters a daughter could carve out a bastion large enough that others would think of violation as suicide. But the club did not consider human tenderness a blank check. The angels voted on many things. Rafe's decisions had support, but they also had critics. The patch existed because it balanced care for the brotherhood against the acid of sentiment. Bringing Lily to the center of this world had shown Rafe to be soft in a way men feared, soft enough that rivals might use it, soft enough that internal rivals might see him as compromised. The first whisper of internal dissent stirred like a nest of bees in the following days. The vote to sanction a man for endangering the patch did not start as hatred. It began as quiet notes in a ledger of responsibility. Rafe saw it coming like a man who knew the terrain of loyalty well. He accepted it with a face of a man ready for the calculus of consequence. This was the point at which the promise he made to Lily became a sacrament and also a cross. He'd saved her. He'd been claimed by something larger than himself. To keep her alive, he would have to give something that might not be replaceable. The club convened, a circle of weathered faces, a room that smelled of beer and old leather. Elder members spoke gently about precedent. Prospects were blunt. The vote unfolded with the procedural lid of ritual: accusations, defenses, and finally a measure of punishment. It wasn't death, it was loss. Rafe was to be stripped of a privilege that was more intangible than his colors. He was to be publicly censured, to lose the right to unilateral enforcement decisions for a season, a diminishing of the captain's sway. It was a symbolic limb, painful but survivable. Rafe took it. He did not protest loudly. There were minutes when he considered whether to argue the point in the bar, to use words sharp enough to slice through the ritual. He chose instead to accept. He knew the law of the patch, and he made space for it to operate. To the brothers, his acceptance was either humility or weakness. It simply was a step he chose so he could maintain other power, control over what mattered. He wanted to protect Lily, but not at the club's implosion. He chose to be disciplined rather than to let a fight escalate into something that would make families into orphans. Marcus went to the meeting that night, the only civilian present, and watched as men he was beginning to understand as complex and dangerous weighed a human decision. There was a moment when Rafe looked at him. The look carried apology and a kind of ferocious protection. Marcus felt at once grateful and humiliated. He wanted to stamp his palm into the table and say, "Do not punish him. Do not touch the man who saved my daughter." But he also knew, with a dull, sharp clarity, that the Hells were a system not swayed by sentiment. "Why did you accept it?" he asked Rafe after the meeting, once the doors were closed and the bar lights dim. The question was small, but it wrenched loose something between them. Marcus could not name precisely what he feared: the loss of Rafe to a punitive ritual, being owed and never quite owning, or the way his daughter's life was intertwining with a force that shaped morality into its own brand. Rafe took a cigarette, though he didn't light it. "Because losing a hand isn't the same as losing a life," he said. "Because if they had to take more than what they can, it would make it easier for someone who wanted to hurt you. This way, I keep my head, I keep my voice, I keep a measure of what I need to keep you safe." Marcus saw the taut economy of consolation in Rafe's words. He also felt the raw edge of indebtedness, like an open wound that would not stop leaking. He wanted to thank him and to bite him at the same time. Instead, he rested his hand on Roth's shoulder, a clumsy, human gesture of solidarity that felt like the giving of a shield back to the man who had given away his discretion to keep a promise. Lily watched all of it in the hush of the kitchen later, the three of them forming a triangular constellation that had once been a simple line. She felt love in more than one direction. Love, gratitude, resentment, and a fierce hunger for autonomy, and the confusion made her dizzy. She loved Roth because he saved her. She resented him because his savior's presence had put them at risk in a way her mother would have scorned. She loved Marcus because he had taught her to roll cinnamon into crust. She resented him because clinging tightened into chains. The space between them was a room that had once been empty, now crowded with histories and bones that could be tripped on. What pushed everything into dangerous potential was the discovery in the soft light of morning a few weeks after the raid. Lily was pregnant. The news arrived in a fold of silence that folded them inward. It was a small, private revelation at first. The nurse's careful script, the slow reading of test results, the uncertain smile. But the reality crystallized into vertical lines, into choices that could fracture as easily as they could bind. Marcus saw the numbers, and his heart gave a lurch that felt like grief and joy braided together. He wanted to be angry, at Roth for being the kind of man who tangled his life up with other lives, at Lily for daring to live in recklessness, but primarily he felt a panic that flattened him to the floor. The rumor that followed would not have been a rumor in any rational world. Of course people would suspect Roth, but in their valley of club politics, it became more. Townspeople exchanged looks that could dissect the pregnant girl's future. The Black Ravens renewed threats that had a different tone now. Leverage was a delicious tool when someone could threaten to use a child as pressure. The Angels moved to shield. Rafe moved differently now. He loved the child because Lily was part of him in a way he had not allowed to exist before. He loved the mother because she was the reason the life would continue. The moral economy he had long avoided now needed reconciliation in the only language his life allowed: sacrifice. Sacrifice in the world of the patch is not always self-blood. Sometimes it's reputation. Sometimes it's time behind the bars of disciplinary action. Sometimes it is the renunciation of the public freedom a man once cherished. Rafe chose to make his sacrifice public. He stood before the club, not in a defensive crouch this time, but with the smallness of a man who wanted to be more than a captain. He wanted to be a father. He announced plainly that the child Lily carried would be his. He offered his name as a shield. "I saved her life," he told them. "Now I'm going to keep it with what it costs." There were gasps, there were barked orders, and there was a silence that felt as big as a sea. Men who had never wanted fatherhood for themselves found themselves applauding or murmuring. Old-timers understood sacrifice. Prospects didn't. The club recognized that Rafe had placed himself in a ledger where he would trade his freedom for someone else's safety. That is a currency the Hells understood. It could be measured. It could be honored. Marcus felt every possible emotion at once when Rafe said the words. There was relief, wild and visceral. There was an insult to his pride. Someone had decided to take his child into their patch without his permission. And there was tentative gratitude that the man who had become the valley's Black Wing would be the one to stand before whatever storm might come. Their conversation after the club meeting was not one of bargaining, but of confession. Rafe detailed, in slow pieces, the risks he had taken, how he had negotiated away certain retaliations so the Ravens would not escalate, how he'd accepted censure rather than war, how he'd already started arranging discreet legal protections for Marcus and Lily that didn't read like favors. He had paid administrators, he had made calls in courts, and he had asked for the kind of favors that cost long loyalty. Marcus listened and counted debts in a way he had never done. Men with patches pay in ways Marcus's life had not required until now. He recognized that Rafe's generosity was also his armor. By stepping forward publicly, by claiming the child, Rafe had made the problem into an obligation the club would have to honor or become monstrous in its failure. That was a cleverness Marcus respected, as he respected very little. The cost of Rafe's claim came quickly. A fight broke out not in the streets, but in the club's hidden ledger. A rival within the Angels saw an opportunity to destabilize the captain, to prove himself by questioning Rafe's judgment and hinting that a leader who lost his cool over saving a civilian might be vulnerable to bigger mistakes. He moved rumors and old grudges and waited for the splinter of dissent to grow into a blade. Rafe met the blade head-on. He did not turn his back on the men who questioned him. He accepted their skepticism and responded with the only thing he had left to give, proof of loyalty that was beyond words. He volunteered for a mission that the club had been debating for months, a withdrawal from a territory the Black Ravens valued. The mission was dangerous because it required precision, infiltration, and the kind of nerve Rafe had always owned. The club would gain strategic control by removing a piece the Ravens had used to extort innocent lives. He knew the mission could cost him friends, could draw blood, and perhaps, worst of all, could be used to justify his own removal if it failed. He went because it was the only move that would both keep his claim intact and give the club what it wanted, a demonstration that he put their codes above his personal attachments. Marcus did not want him to go. He wanted a world where men did not have to prove their love with violence. Rafe's decision, however, came with the logic of someone living in a landscape where mercy alone did not keep wolves away. He would go to make sure his promise to Lily was not a hollow vow. He would step into danger because he had learned that some promises were not about sentiment, they were about currency. He told Marcus that he would return. He did not make it a vow he expected to matter to fate. He made it a promise he would keep because he had always kept the promises that mattered. The night before Rafe left, Lily did something small that marked the clean distance between a girl and a woman. She packed his duffel with a shirt that smelled of home, a hand-stitched charm, and a note that said, small as a prayer, "Come back." She did not ask, she did not beg. She simply folded her desire into a fabric square. When she handed it to him, her hands were steady, but her voice shook. He put the bundle against his chest like someone who needed a talisman. They kissed, not a verdict this time, but a tender, furnished thing, each of them willing to stake their hearts on the uncertain ledger. The mission was brutal in its precision. Rafe moved like a man who had learned how to make battle a means of minimizing loss. The operation took place along the river, a narrow cut of land where Ravens had been stashing contraband to sell to the town's darker appetites. The Angels needed to sever that vein. The Ravens would not give it away without a struggle. There were shooting stars of light and fists, strategy that required both cunning and violence. At one point, when the lead Raven reached for a weapon, Roth intervened with a brutality that shocked even the men who rode with him. He could have killed, but instead he broke a limb and let the law, his law, do the rest. It was a calculated cruelty meant to prevent death. Yet the universe, biased, often, and capricious, demanded a price. In the late hour, a hidden accomplice appeared, a member of a third, smaller gang whose loyalty had been bought by the Ravens. He fired a shot that ricocheted where fate is uncertain and hit a man near Roth. The man fell with a grace that makes you wish you could rewind the world. Roth cradled him and felt the panic of someone who would not find easy answers in a hand's movement. He cursed the sky and then moved with a captain's cold clarity. He stabilized, he carried, he ensured the fallen man would live. The cost was not in a life ended, but in the revelation that sometimes even surgical violence leaves scars deep in the ones who must perform it. When the dust settled, the angels had the rise they wanted. The Ravens pulled back, bruised and humiliated. The club returned with trophies of a sort, evidence of victory, and the bodies of men who would now think twice before violating the valley again. Roth returned with a bruise under his eye and a hand that shook at night. He had been praised and criticized in the same breath. He had given a measure of himself, and that had recalibrated the ledger. He also returned with a secret he had not expected. His brother, an old man of the club who had hated sentiment, had helped him arrange a legal document that would bind certain protections to Marcus and Lily if anything more dire happened. It was a bureaucratic bandage in a violent world. It meant they had a lawyer on retainer and a path to safety if the Ravens attempted to twist the child's existence into leverage. Hector, Roth's oldest friend, handed Marcus the phone number of a woman who could get them services under the table. Hector's gruff voice said simply, "You keep that girl safe, son. We're not letting her go." The valley breathed out. Wounds are not healed by one incision. There would be scars and resentments, and nights when the sound of an engine seemed like a possible harbinger. But in the unglamorous space of the days that followed, something gentler rooted, a new arrangement. Rafe did not give Marcus his past. Marcus did not ask for it. They traded instead the right to choose and the right to protect. Marcus began to see Rafe in a new light, not as the man who had taken power with violence, but as one who had placed himself where a bullet and a law could find purchase and had chosen sacrifice over spectacle. Lily, watching them both, felt the fragile architecture of their new family form like frost on a morning. Delicate, beautiful, likely to melt, but also real. She and Rafe took long rides in the quiet of late afternoons, sometimes without words, sometimes with confessions that were little asides into the dark. Marcus, when he could, joined them. It did not always fit like a puzzle, but it fit. There were quiet reckonings. Rafe had to explain to the club how you could love the son of a man with a patch and still be a brother. Marcus had to learn to accept help he had always refused out of pride. Lily had to imagine motherhood in a valley where her child would have to bear the shadow of a patch or the distance of a normal life that might not tolerate such a lineage. They built a plan that was part compromise and part stubbornness. Rafe would be a presence, not an overlord. Marcus would have a voice. Lily would be the mother who both baked cinnamon rolls and learned to install a carburetor. The child, when it came, would be loved fiercely on every front. Their redemption was not cinematic. It was the slow accretion of small things. A repaired fence paid for by the club. A medical plan tacked into a ledger. A Saturday morning when Rafe brought donuts and made sure Lily laughed. The claim had become less about possession and more about shared custody of heartache and joy. There was sacrifice. Rafe lost certain privileges. and, for a season, the glimmer of invulnerability that came with being head of a brotherhood. He wore the censure like a wound that would heal into something else: humility. Marcus lost the simple story of fatherhood. He gained a difficult, complicated, vibrant family. Lily lost the easy innocence of youth and gained a love that required boundaries, negotiations, and sometimes the knowledge that her life would be explained to other men in a language she didn't love. But in the quiet after the tornado, when the valley bathed itself in hush and the scent of rain softened dirt, Marcus watched Rafe sitting in the kitchen with his daughter, reading a pamphlet on infant care God only knew who had slipped him, and felt a tenderness so large it nearly made him break. The club had not given him a saint. They had given him a man who would cut out a piece of himself to keep a promise. The price had been paid in ritual and in risk, and perhaps that was the truest currency of a life rebuilt. Rafe kissed Lily on the forehead the night before she went into labor, a searing, quiet promise that all the syntax of men could not fully hold. "I'll be here," he said, as plain as a hammer hitting steel. Marcus, holding both their hands, understood finally that the debt had evolved into a partnership forged of danger and redemption. The valley had thundered, and in the stillness after the storm, they assembled the fragile future with the blunt tools they had: loyalty, blood, and a claim that was both given and earned. Morning came soft, the valley easing into a rhythm that belonged to small mercies. The baby arrived in a blur of whispered commands, steady hands, and a wail that rearranged everything. When Lily cradled the child against her chest, Marcus wept in a way that unclenched him. Rafe stood at the foot of the bed, a captain whose uniform was now sleepless eyes and a tenderness he did not parade. He reached forward and touched the infant's fingers as if cataloging a miracle he had earned with scars. They built a life measured in shifts and compromise. Rafe took late nights on the porch while the baby slept, listening to the valley and remembering that safety was the presence of someone who kept promises. Marcus learned to ask for help and to accept Rafe's presence without turning it into ownership. Lily grew into a mother with the stubborn curiosity that had charmed them. She learned diapers and DMV forms and kept the charm Rafe had given her tucked in a toolbox. Neighbors softened. The angels fixed roofs and paid for medicine when need pressed. The ravens kept distance, chastened. Inside the clubhouse, grudges eased into stories told with less venom. Rafe's censure became a badge of a man who would trade rank for life. He resumed leadership with a humility that made him fiercer, not weaker. There were nights when Lily woke and both men were there, one bleary-eyed with coffee, the other steady with a soft joke, leaning over her shoulder to watch the child breathe. They learned to quarrel without claws, to set boundaries, to forgive without tallying costs. The baby's first laugh turned old wounds into something manageable, a memory you could handle if you kept your hands steady. Years later, when the child took their first stumble into a parking lot full of bikes, Marcus didn't flinch. Rafe slid a small hand into his and squeezed. Lily laughed, the sound a clean bell, and together they watched their small, complicated family ride into a life that had once seemed impossible. They were not saints, they were practitioners of devotion. Under the wide valley sky, imperfect and brave, they were enough. Sometimes at dusk, Rafe would hum an old outlaw lullaby while Marcus built a crib, and Lily would watch them both and know that the life they had forged, danger stitched to tenderness, was, improbably, the only home she wanted.